Welcome to everybody, indeed a very warm welcome. And we are very excited to have so many people who made the effort to actually register and join us for this webinar. And we are also very encouraged that it indicates a lot of energy out there to take on the Davos agenda. And this afternoon, we are going to have a very distinguished panel with us who will help us to get on top of the very latest in relation to the Davos agenda. All of us, I think, are reeling from the special intensity of the COVID crisis, but also from the many interrelating crises that we have seen intensify in the last few years, and from listening also to the corporate sector, which keeps telling us and trying to persuade us that they have the agenda. I think this evening we will really see what the actual agenda is of Davos. It is certainly not in the interests of the people. It's not in the interests of health for the people, food for the people, education for the people, a climate where people could live in and have a livelihood that is livable, and certainly the use of internet that could actually create better conditions also for living. So we will be looking at what is wrong with the Davos agenda. We will also be looking at what people are doing about it in the various sectors. So we are extremely pleased to have with us our panel this evening. And before I proceed, I really want to thank everybody from among our co-organizers, organizations from across the spectrum that are working on the Davos agenda. So corporate accountability, Friends of the Earth International, the G2H2, the FIAN International, MSI Integrity, the People's Health Movement, the Global South, IITC Group, IT for Change, PSI, and the Transnational Institute. We are really pleased to welcome also, I guess, many from those organizations on the webinar, but also really to say a very warm thanks before we start, because it's been a tremendous work. It's been a great experience, actually. And we think that we're laying the ground for some really strong collaborative work together. So I will now shift to our panel. Maybe just in terms of some ground rules, we unfortunately, with the, shall we say, the rigidity of the webinar system, we really have to be quite strict on time. So we are asking everybody to maximize their time, and I will need to be quite a bit strict, actually. I'm informed about the time frame. So yeah, without taking any more time here, I will ask Harris Kleckman. Harris has been, well, maybe he's a veteran among us in relation to working on these issues. He worked before with the TNC Trade Center, the TNC Center at the UN, but more recently has been doing a lot of excellent work on the Davos agenda, and he has been able to also put a lot of work into the preparation of this webinar. And so I will ask Harris to introduce, and then he will be followed by Manahan, who is working with the conflict research group at the Ghent University, Beyond Global Development. And Marianne has also been one of the key researchers in doing the mapping for this particular area of work. So you are both very welcome. So Harris, I will ask you to open the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brid, and I look forward to participating in the discussion today. And my pleasure is that it's really helpful every once in a while to step back and try to get a 30,000-foot view of the very apparently complicated system we have of global governance, and to figure out the way in which each of us, working on specific topics and before specific parts of the UN system, can understand some of the commonalities and some of the differences between how global governance of TNCs is affecting each of our efforts and each of our struggles. Because global governance is a central part of almost all global issues. My introduction today is based on a 3-part PowerPoint that is now available on the TNI site. This PowerPoint asks 3 different questions. What's happening? What's the status of trying to do global governance of multinationals and TNCs? What does it look like that we now have multi-stakeholder governance as a oppositional competitive force to multilateralism? And how do we try to grapple with our overall frustration with where we are now in global institutions? And how can we start to think differently about the future? These 3 questions are intended to try to open up our conversation today and provide a bit of an umbrella for a range of important sectorial ways in which these issues are coming up. And so what I would like to do in my short time is to give you a taste of these PowerPoints that can be potentially helpful, I hope, in bringing some of the newer organizers up to speed more quickly about the nature of what's happening in global governance with multi-stakeholderism and future thinking. So where are we now? Global governance of TNCs has been going on for a while, or attempts at it have been going on for a while. Sometimes the balance of multilateralism attempting to govern globalization has moved to the left, particularly in the 60s and in the 70s. After that, the boundary moved to the right with the Reagan-Thatcher deregulation and the Washington Consensus. But the process of trying to address issues of the governance of TNCs has gone on separately on individual different calendars at different times and in different places with different organizations. And that's going to be an important part of what you will hear later today. The international system essentially has 5 tools that it could use to govern globalization and TNCs. Hard law, treaties, conventions, things which are binding on states. Soft law is announcements from UN organizations, global policy advice from intergovernmental bodies are amongst the characteristics of soft law. Standard setting is where a particular activity is the focus of the governance effort, whether it's coffee, cotton, internet governance. To get some things on the international agenda, both civil society organizations and the media and the multilateral system engage in problem-defining research, the background to getting an item on the global agenda. And of course, there's the finances, the flow of money. What's a bit challenging today is in the last 20 years, all of these 5 are undergoing very significant changes. For example, and the full presentation goes through each of these. Hard law. At one point, hard law knew the negotiations of conventions and agreements was a dynamic activity. Think back that we have a convention on climate. In 2009 in Copenhagen, it almost became a voluntary Copenhagen Accord. Out of Paris, we have a voluntary climate agreement. We've replaced writing hard binding obligations on states with soft law. And we replaced it by a system of voluntarism. Countries can do as they wish. But the context of this change is important to recognize in another way. States in international law have obligations, have liabilities, and have responsibilities. Yet the actors who have jumped in at the moment, TNCs and their friends, they have avoided any of these obligations and responsibilities and liabilities as they've become part of a system of voluntarism. So each of these areas are in rapid transition. And one of the things which is quite important is to keep a sense of how each could be used and how they have all now, in one way or another, been weakened in their ability for the multilateral system to have a powerful role in governing globalization and in governing TNCs. So what we have now is the emergence of multi-stakeholderism. And this is changing the game in a number of fundamental ways. Before one had multilateralism having a claim to trying to govern globalization, in the last 20 or 30 years, many in the multilateral system in the government side have even stopped trying to govern globalization and TNCs. But with the introduction of multi-stakeholderism, there's a new candidate who's claiming that they are governing globalization. This casual diagram is multilateralism. That is, countries gather together at general assemblies to work out a position on those issues, to coordinate their thinking, to learn from each other. But the general assemblies of the United Nations system are where states meet. What multi-stakeholderism is doing is it has changed the central actor. The concept of this table, of this graph, came from Klaus Schwab's 1970s and 2010 publications. I modified it slightly to make the case that TNCs in multi-stakeholder governance are in the center. And they reach out to friendly governments, to friends in the UN system, friends in civil society, and take on the governance of a specific area of the international arena. These forms of their taking on issues divide roughly into 3 boxes. And you'll hear later today, there's a candidate 4th box. But let me address 3 of them. One is developing global policies. The World Economic Forum convenes people to develop a common consensus of how to deal with gender, how to deal with education, how to deal with health issues, to lay the ideological framework, the epistemological framework, and to set a policy agenda through their sets of meetings. The second group of multi-stakeholders are setting these product and technology standards, be it the internet, be it protecting marine populations, protecting forests. These, using the frame of going product and technology by itself, whether it's high-tech issues of nanotechnologies, where they make a concerted effort to make sure that the rules set for that area are handled by a multi-stakeholder body outside of state involvement. The longest and largest number of multi-stakeholder bodies are ones which deliver specific projects. At the national level, these are public-private partnerships. In this whole area of multi-stakeholderism, as it's struggling to gain recognition, it introduces vocabulary which is intentionally confusing. Public-private partnerships. The public on that refers not just to the government, but it refers to civil society organizations, local forces, academics, and then the private gets its own title. At the global level, we are delivering projects, the Sustainable Development Goals, the appeal of the UN system is that project should be delivered in large part by multi-stakeholder groups. Similarly in climate and in other areas.
Excuse me, Horace, I think you have just 1 minute now to wind up, please.
Thank you. But all of these have common features, and they can be, they're all voluntary. How would we want to think about going ahead? And I want to say that early on, when the current system, which we understand as normal, was built before the end of the Second World War, 1943 they started. And so now it's very appropriate that we now have in the current crises an opportunity to start thinking about how to change the global narrative of expectations, how to change the institutions, the actors, the financing. And in the PowerPoint, each of these is separately looked at, suggesting a simple response for each one of them, other potential candidates to stimulate thinking, but we have to recognize that they will produce challenges, but we have various steps that we can take to begin to move in a new and sounder direction. So I look forward to hearing the variations, the flavors of how these issues are appearing in all the independent sectors. And the overall presentations are available for all from the TNI website. And I'll look forward to seeing and understanding how we can evolve our common understanding of the challenges facing us and the possible routes forward. Thank you very much, Brid.
Thank you, Horace. And maybe for everybody's information, the links for the PowerPoint are also available on the chat, or they will be on the TNI website and the website of several of the organizations who co-organize the webinar. Thank you for your panorama, Horace. I think you've introduced many of the key features of what we're dealing with when we talk about the question of global governance as it is today, and the high ambition of transnational corporations at the center of it. So it's not a case of one or two transnational corporations like Pfizer and Monsanto and Apple, those that we are very familiar with in our daily life. These are not single operators. They are really especially coming together in the Davos agenda, in the World Economic Forum for the big cherry of all, which is the global governance and how we live our life and how corporations can continue to gain profit. So I think now we come to Manahan, because we've been able not only to see the bigger picture, the major trends, but we have Manahan with us she's Filipina, feminist and activist researcher. She is currently with the Ghent University Beyond Development Global Working Group and also the conflict research group. And Manahan has been actually leading the mapping on how multi-stakeholderism is manifested and how it looks today. So Marianne, I turn over to you, and you have 10 minutes. And if you can please keep within the time. Thank you, Marianne.
Thank you very much, Brid, for the generous introduction. Like what Brid mentioned, I will be introducing the preliminary findings and key features of the ongoing and quick mapping exercise of global multi-stakeholder institutions that we conducted from December to January 2021. The objective of this mapping is to provide a landscape of what we call as MSIs, sort of like the acronym of multi-stakeholder institutions, what are out there in terms of the 5 sectors that we're dealing with in terms of internet and data governance, agriculture, food and land, climate, environment, education, and health. We focus on these sectors primarily because they are the most relevant and most realistic to do given the time frame that we have. But at the same time, we know for a fact that we're still gonna continue adding new sectors as we go along. In terms of the mapping, the key objective that we want is to understand the key common features and characteristic across the sectors, a multi-sectoral approach to it, and to provide input to possible counter strategies of the corporate capture of global governance and guideposts for future research. So in terms of the number of MSIs that we mapped out, we have about 105 multi-stakeholder institutions and mechanisms and groups that we have identified. The caveat, of course, it's not exhaustive and it's focused mainly on global MSIs in the 21st century. We haven't covered the MSIs from 1990s to 2000, and in terms of the number, we identified 27 that are working on agriculture, land, food and nutrition, 23 on climate and environment, 23 again on internet and data governance. There are about 17 on global health. Education is the lowest in terms of education, and there are 3 multiple sectors MSIs. Next, please. Yes. So in terms of the timeline, I think Harris has mentioned that in terms of moving of MSI multilateralism from the left to the right and the jump to multi-stakeholderism. And we have seen quite a mushrooming or growing of MSIs starting from the 2000, the first decade of the 21st century. We've identified 42 mechanisms launched, but they kind of increased from 2010 to 2020. And these are actually the times wherein the MDGs and UN Global Compact were launched in the first decade of the 21st century. But also the SDGs was launched, if we remember, in 2015. And multi-stakeholderism is actually one of the key strategies that is identified by the Sustainable Development Goals. So it's not surprising that we're seeing more and more a growing number of global MSIs being launched in the second half of the decade. And I think we're going to expect that more will become. Just this January, there were 2 MSIs that were launched. So who makes the decisions among these MSIs? We've identified 484 unique stakeholders that are present in the 185, and a whopping number, 31% or 150 business and industry representatives actually dominate the decision makings of the MAP MSIs. So as you can see from the graph, the orange one are the business and industry. It's followed by academic research training institutions that are friendly to corporations. The next ones are the friendly international NGOs. And then only 4th will come as UN bodies. So you can see sort of like from this graph, the unevenness and again, the global capture of these MSIs as what Harriet mentioned in his overview about the concept of multi-stakeholderism. Next, please. So in terms of typologies, remember that Harris gave you 3 types in terms of policy-oriented, standard-setting ones, and project-oriented MSIs. What we have actually seen is that there is a new category called what we call as paradigmatic or campaign-oriented MSIs. And this is something that's more insidious and qualitatively more different than policy-oriented ones because they apart from trying to change the discourse and putting forward frameworks and ideologies that want to change the system or forward systemic change, they actually act as campaign vehicles. So the strategies that they use are actually what social movements use. Combination of research, combination of advocacy, partnership, as well as knowledge production and mobilization of funds. So these are actually new generation of MSIs that we've seen in the 21st century. But at the same time, we've seen in the last 20 years, more than 1/3 of the MAP MSIs actually combine multiple orientations. So in the past, you actually have single MSIs that are all only focused on either policy or project. But in the 21st century, there's a combination of this. And combination, whether it's combination of policy project with financing or combination of high impact standards. So you see that the point of, I think, of the slide that we found out in terms of the data that we've gathered is that there are many permutations and evolving MSIs that we're seeing now in the 21st century. Next, please. Yes, and one example of this paradigmatic and campaign-oriented MSI that I've been talking about is this acceleration of the nexus of market-based solution or ideas that the World Economic Forum and World Business Council on Sustainable Development has been pushing. This is just one section of the agriculture, climate, environment, and nutrition holistic approach that they're putting forward. And these many MSIs that are either being a host, convener, or actually part of the governing bodies of these are actually centered around the idea of putting corporations at the center or driver's seat for putting forward false solutions or solutions that will benefit at the end corporations or transnational corporations. Next, please. Okay, I'm sorry for the interpreters. I'll try to slow down. So just to extend what Harris mentioned about what MSIs do, he already mentioned that they offer technical assistance to states and public institutions. They monitor and actually do their own research and knowledge production. They set standards. They implement policies themselves. But the caveat is that they use both public and private funding. So one of the key main funders of the 105 MSIs that we've mapped out are actually the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the World Bank, and G7 countries. And these top three key actors actually finances 65% of the MSIs that we've mapped out. So you can see the kind of private-public partnership, not only in terms of the MSIs and in this mechanism, but also in terms of financing and mobilizing resources for these MSIs to move forward with their agenda. Next, please. This is probably not a surprising thing, but we just wanted to put forward out there that 4 out of the 10 mechanisms or MSIs that we actually mapped out are located either in Geneva or Washington, D.C. And these are the 2 cities where you can find the World Economic Forum and the UN System Organization, as well as the World Bank headquartered. And furthermore, again, to emphasize how these MSIs are, again, deciding on our future, the public's future, they're really detached away from realities of people, because most of them, majority of them, are located in the global north, no? In Switzerland, in the US, in the Netherlands, in Italy, in Germany, in the UK, in France, and only a few countries, 7 of them, actually can be found in the global south. Next, please. Just on the final, I think while we're thinking about co-construction of counter strategies to really deal collectively with the increasing hegemony and dominance of corporate capture of of global governance institutions and spaces, it's very important to take note of the key strategies and common approaches that they have. And common among these 105 MSIs that we have mapped is a combination of research, knowledge production, the power of convening, and partnerships. And this is where I think the tripartism between research institutions, the TNCs, as well as government are coming into at the forefront. So if we want to think about ways of countering them, we have to deal with this kind of strategies, which is actually strategies that many social movements and civil society organizations, progressive organizations are doing. And just on a final note, I think just to a little bit of caveat with the data that we have unearthed. We have about 21 data set points that we have managed to put together in a database, and we're just starting to unearth the rich data that we have gathered. In the next months, we will try to further dig deeper into this to really understand the key features, the characteristics, and the changing dynamics that many of these MSIs are playing out for us to be able to contribute to the discourse of the movements in terms of countering the corporate capture of global governance. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Marianne. Yeah, I guess maybe the interpreters had a little bit of a hard time, and we know that it's just a lot of effort to give the key points in such a short time. Your presentation has been very complimentary to Harris's outline. And I think for any of us who've had any illusions that we were really being governed by our governments, we have to take a deep second look. And we see how the strategies and the timeline over such a short period of time, in a way of 20 years, where the centralization and the focus of corporations at the center of global governance, also positioned for key decision making. And this three triplets that you identified of research and combination with money and partnership. This is, I think we will hear more about this as we go through the webinar still this afternoon, the program. So I think these are, of course, and the slides I think have been great, but these are not realities that are staying in the slides. These are realities that are really reaching deeply into all our lives, actually. And we have now representatives from key movements who are dealing with this on the ground, both in terms of knowing the impacts of how this corporate capture affects their daily lives, but also what they are doing in response to this. Because indeed, we will, I think, have a picture that people are not simply being passive in relation to this. So I would like to call Saul Vicente, who is from the International Indian Treaty Council. You're very welcome, Saul. You are coming to us from Mexico, from the Zapotec indigenous leader. And we especially welcome you to share with us your experience and your strategies in dealing with this corporate capture. Thank you, Saul.
Thank you, Brit.
Yes.
And I speak in Spanish. I'm sorry. And I start with my my words in my language, indigenous language. Diski pelatu, picheka bizanaka. Luni zendagi jitu narari, chiguinu dija, shinga nika yuninu. Danigijila Justinu, Nishimodo Rikini, Gukalu, Tiganda, Chugandana Zakane, Chugandana Yeche, Danikashkijin. Muy buenos días, hermanas y hermanos. Les he dado un saludo en mi palabra, mi lengua zapoteca. Muchísimas gracias por la invitación que nos han hecho. Y bueno, soy Saúl Vicente Vázquez, la zapoteca de México. Y soy miembro del Consejo Internacional de Tratados Indios que participa en el Comité Internacional de Planificación por la Soberanía Alimentaria y el mecanismo de la sociedad civil y pueblos indígenas en el Comité de Seguridad Alimentaria Mundial. Ahora, en base a la primera pregunta que nos formularon, quiero señalar que en el caso de la agricultura y la alimentación, como se ha señalado con las anteriores presentaciones, y una disculpa por llegar tarde, tenía la liga de conexión del día de ayer, no del día de hoy. Pero bueno, ya estamos acá. Y como se ha mencionado, el gran capital, sus grandes corporaciones y los gobiernos asociados a ellos mantienen su objetivo de continuar a pesar del fracaso que el modelo de agricultura y de alimentación industrial ha presentado, porque ha generado una situación de inseguridad alimentaria y malnutrición y de pobreza para la mayoría de la población mundial. Por lo anterior, ante la convocatoria lanzada por el secretario de Naciones Unidas a la realización de una cumbre de Naciones Unidas sobre los sistemas alimentarios para abordar los desafíos que estos sistemas alimentarios insostenibles plantean al clima, a la biodiversidad, manifestamos nuestras preocupaciones en una carta que fue firmada por cientos de organizaciones y que hasta la fecha no hemos tenido ninguna respuesta. Desde entonces manifestamos nuestra preocupación de que ese proceso de organización de la cumbre no corresponde a los mecanismos de política multilateral basado en los derechos humanos, que fuera legítimo, que fuera inclusivo, de acuerdo como se han realizado otras cumbres mundiales sobre la alimentación en años anteriores y que dieron paso, por ejemplo, a la creación de mecanismos de gobernanza innovadores, inclusivos y participativos con el objetivo de lograr la realización del derecho a una alimentación adecuada para todas y todos. Esas decisiones, por ejemplo, en años anteriores dio paso a la reforma del actual Comité de Seguridad Alimentaria Mundial y después dio paso a la creación del mecanismo de la sociedad civil y pueblos indígenas. Sin embargo, esta cumbre, que está convocada por el secretario general, se ha venido organizando con un formato poco democrático y poco transparente, teniendo un fuerte enfoque en lo que se ha señalado de múltiples partes interesadas. Para nosotros, la plataforma de múltiples partes interesadas son elemento fundamental en el rediseño corporativo de la gobernanza mundial. En lugar de organizar la formulación de políticas en el ámbito de las normas claras y el derecho vinculante en que los estados adoptan decisiones como titulares de obligaciones en materias de derechos humanos, con mecanismos claros de participación y rendición de cuentas, las plataformas de múltiples interesados solamente aportan múltiples interesados, entre comillas, a los debates sobre políticas, pero sin normas claras de participación y solamente para que ellos puedan tomar las decisiones. Ante esta situación, ¿qué estrategias venimos desarrollando? Ante la convocatoria a la cumbre sobre sistemas alimentarios de la ONU, los pueblos indígenas, los trabajadores y trabajadoras, las personas sin tierras, los pescadores y pescadoras, campesinos y campesinas, personas que se dedican a la agricultura familiar, los pastores y pastoras, en fin, una gama de organizaciones y plataformas que participamos en el mecanismo de la sociedad civil y pueblos indígenas, decidimos lanzar un llamamiento abierto a la participación de otros movimientos, redes y organizaciones que se preocupan por la alimentación y sus múltiples conexiones con otros ámbitos esenciales de nuestras vidas y que denuncian los esfuerzos de las empresas por socavar los derechos humanos, como hoy se está haciendo por parte de quienes han convocado a este seminario. Y este llamamiento abierto ha sido con el objetivo de unir fuerzas y desafiar esa cumbre de la ONU sobre sistemas alimentarios. El llamamiento que hemos hecho pretende impulsar un proceso de elaboración de estrategias conjuntas en torno a cuestiones esenciales para la vida y el bienestar de nuestros pueblos y comunidades, la alimentación, la salud, la naturaleza, la soberanía alimentaria, la justicia económica, social, de género y la justicia climática son parte de los temas que queremos abordar. En la coyuntura actual, pensamos que es más urgente que nunca la necesidad de transformar radicalmente los sistemas alimentarios insalubres, injustos e insostenibles para dar paso a sistemas alimentarios basados en derechos humanos y configurados en torno a la soberanía alimentaria como una precondición de la seguridad alimentaria y con base en la agroecología. Por eso consideramos importante organizarnos sobre la base de nuestros propios principios de autonomía y autoorganización, independientemente de la cumbre, y crear nuestro propio espacio de convergencia para profundizar nuestros análisis, articular nuestras propuestas y movilizarnos para nuestras soluciones. Pensamos desde los pueblos indígenas que debemos continuar utilizando nuestra espiritualidad y la fortaleza de nuestros pueblos para continuar resistiendo e impulsar las prácticas propias como el buen vivir, la comunalidad, los sistemas alimentarios tradicionales, la convivencia con el bosque, con nuestras aguas, la protección de nuestras semillas, la medicina natural tradicional, el fortalecimiento de nuestras culturas y construir así un sistema de gobernanza para la vida. Esto es lo que pretendemos, esto es lo que queremos pronunciarnos ahora, aprovechando este espacio de este seminario para enfrentar de esta manera la situación de esta nueva gobernanza que nos están imponiendo a todos nuestros pueblos y nuestras comunidades. Muchísimas gracias. Dios quiere pelatu, bicheca, bizana.
Okay, thank you, Vicente. Or Saul. I think you have certainly very much elaborated the deep concern at the grassroots level, where food is really a daily requirement. Safe food that also is produced respecting people and also respecting nature. And your vision for challenging, not your vision and your mobilization for challenging the Food System Summit is really something I think many people will want to get involved in. And maybe you can also indicate in the chat how people can also connect with that effort for those who are interested. Thank you, Saul. And now I come to Leticia Paranhos. Leticia is coordinating the Friends of the Earth International. She's coordinating the program of economic justice and resisting neoliberalism. She's representing here the Friends of the Earth International. Is from Brazil, and she will especially share with us how the issue of corporate capture is affecting climate. And I think many of us will have resonance with what Leticia has to say. Thank you, Leticia.
Hola, hola compas. ¿Me escuchan bien? ¿Sí? Hola compas, un saludo internacionalista a todas y todos que luchan en contra del poder corporativo. Quiero empezar recordando los años 90, en el auge del neoliberalismo, cuando en preparación de las conferencias de Naciones Unidas sobre desarrollo sostenible en Río de Janeiro, ECO 92, se creó los Major Groups, cuando el sector empresarial fue considerado sociedad civil, lado a lado con grupos de mujeres, ONGs, pueblos indígenas, sindicatos, y las empresas han adquirido el derecho de discutir con los gobiernos sobre cuestiones medioambientales en el mismo nivel, pero a partir de sus intereses privados y de su enorme y desigual poder político y económico. Hemos estado, como Amigos de la Tierra Internacional, posicionándonos en contra de este proceso de la captura corporativa en los espacios de gobernanza global. El impacto quedó obvio en las décadas siguientes, con el Pacto Global en 2000, las parcerías público-privadas en la Rio+10 en los años 2002, hasta que la ola del lavado verde, el greenwashing en inglés, iniciada en los 90, desaguara en la falsa solución capitalista de la economía verde, como agenda central de las negociaciones en la Ghent 2012. Y volviendo acá, para los días de hoy, al calendario de Davos, tenemos una estrella del ambientalismo de mercado, que es el cero neto, que se basa en la misma lógica de contabilidad y compensación financiera de carbón que originó las trampas de la economía verde y que avanzó en las negociaciones de la ONU sobre clima y biodiversidad. Pero cero neto no significa que no habrá pérdida de carbón, de biodiversidad, de vida, pues las actividades económicas con impactos negativos seguirán llevándose a cabo. Neta lo que hace es permitir la destrucción de la biodiversidad en algún lugar determinado, bajo la presunción de que se protegerá la biodiversidad en algún otro lugar. Y además, como trae la compensación, conlleva al acaparamiento de tierra. O sea, una empresa ya no solo poseerá el lugar donde lleva a cabo el proyecto contaminador, destructor, sino también aquel donde se realizará la compensación. Y crea un nuevo negocio financiero y de competencia por la tierra. La compensación se vende en mercados financieros y a futuro. Cuanto más se destruye, más caros son los bonos verdes de compensación. De modo que la destrucción es algo bueno para el mercado. Además de no ser una solución para las crisis que vivimos, estos mecanismos afectan directamente la vida de la gente. Y los más afectados son los pueblos indígenas, quilombolas y comunidades tradicionales, que viven en los territorios que ahora deben ser intocables para servir a estas empresas. Derechos colectivos y derechos humanos son violados y los pueblos pierden el control y el poder de decisión sobre sus propios territorios. Y para hablar de estrategias, bueno, nuestras estrategias es luchar en contra de todas las formas de captura corporativa y luchar en defensa de la formulación de políticas públicas de manera que sean llevadas a cabo por gobiernos elegidos democráticamente para defender el interés público, es decir, luchar por la democracia, gobiernos que deben representar los intereses de sus pueblos, al igual que los pueblos también deben poder participar activamente en la formulación y aplicación de estas políticas. De ninguna manera debemos permitir que las transnacionales se apropien de las definiciones de las políticas mediante lobby o otros mecanismos como los acuerdos de libre comercio, o incluso permitir que las empresas cuestionen las políticas públicas, por ejemplo, desde el ISDS, el sistema de arbitraje entre el Estado y el inversor, y mucho menos que se sienten en la mesa de negociaciones como iguales, como partes interesadas, con el mismo o mayor peso que la sociedad civil. Para atacar el nervio central del sistema es que hacemos parte desde el 2012, desde la Cumbre de los Pueblos en la Ghent, junto con más de 200 movimientos sociales de la campaña global para desmantelar el poder corporativo. Pues ahí luchamos por un tratado jurídicamente vinculante en materia de derechos humanos e empresas que pretende poner fin a la impunidad de las transnacionales y más que eso, el proceso ha roto con el mito de que las transnacionales son intocables. Para derrotar la captura corporativa, entendemos que desde los niveles más locales hasta los espacios de las Naciones Unidas, nuestra respuesta es colectiva, estar organizados en lucha, articulados en estos espacios, construyendo poder popular, mediante el fortalecimiento de las agendas compartidas entre los movimientos para avanzar en un proyecto político basado en la justicia ambiental, de género, social y económica, en los derechos y la soberanía de los pueblos. Muchas gracias. La lucha continúa contra el sistema capitalista, patriarcal y racista.
Thank you, Leticia. That was a great note on which to finish. And also thank you for giving big challenges in a very short time. Thank you very much. And now I would like to remind our participants around the world, would you please put your questions on the question and answer feature at the bottom of the Zoom, and not on the chat. Yeah, I mean, the chat is more for your reflections and comments and so on. So if you can please do that on the Q&A, and we will, there are colleagues of mine are actually monitoring the Q&A, and they will cluster the questions and put them forward in a short while. So now I would like to call on Sun Kim from South Korea. Sun is from the People's Health Movement, International People's Health Movement, and she will, I think, also have, yeah, I mean, a lot of us are familiar because of COVID, the COVID pandemic, with the impacts of multilateralism and corporate governance in corporate capture in the governance of health. But I think Sun Kim has a lot more to share with us. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Britt. I'd like to introduce the COVAX as an example of multi-stakeholder approach to global health governance and how People's Health Movement was backed by engaging WHO and WTO. Next slide, please. Yes. In April last year, WHO launched Access to COVID-19 Tools Accelerator and issued a commitment and call to action. WHO describes ACTA as a global collaboration to accelerate the development, production, and equitable access to new COVID-19 technologies and products. COVAX is the ACTA vaccines pillar, which supports the building of manufacturing capabilities and buying supply ahead of time so that 2 billion doses can be fairly distributed by the end of 2021. As of 19th January this year, ACTA faces a huge funding gap. Next slide, please. Yes. So COVAX is convened by CEPI, Gavi, and WHO. CEPI and Gavi are typical global health PPPs, predominantly funded by Gates Foundation, and they dominate the COVAX while marginalize WHO. Based on their existing expertise, CEPI takes responsibility of development and manufacturing, and Gavi takes of procurement and delivery. Most of us are quite familiar with the COVAX facility, a platform that Gavi uses for its responsibility. You might be aware of that CEPI was launched at Davos meeting in 2017. Next slide, please. But for the COVAX itself, even it faces a huge funding gap, most of the current funding comes from the governments. Of course, most likely from high-income countries. Actually, with this amount of funding, government should be funding WHO, not giving a multi-stakeholder groups the power to decide which developing countries get the vaccine. Next slide, please. Yes. The governance of COVAX makes WHO member states, especially from low and middle income countries, lack decision-making role, and also impose limitations to meaningful civil society engagement. Next slide, please. So what it means for people's lives. Clearly, as what we all are witnessing, the inequitable access to COVID-19 vaccines. While high-income countries are seeking bilateral advance purchase deals, COVAX does not ensure enough doses, does not enable transfer of technology and for rapid scale-up of manufacture, is not transparent in agreements with other countries, so the prices, delivery schedules, quantities are known. Next slide, please. So how PHM, People's Health Movement, fights back to democratize the global health governance? So first, we engage the WHO. We do watch the WHO. As a global health movement network of networks, PHM activists collectively develop commentaries on the World Health Assembly and Executive Board meeting agendas and circulate and spread them among the global health civil society, as well as the member states, especially from low and middle income countries. Next slide, please. Second, we engage the WTO. So the TRIPS waiver campaign is the most striking issue at the moment, not only for the PHM, but also for the whole global health society. It is a campaign to urge member states to support the waiver proposal that initiated by the India and South Africa. The waiver would lead to rapid scaling up of manufacture and enhance the affordability, which in turn would lead to more equitable access to vaccines. The challenge is low and middle income countries, the IP importers strongly support the proposal, but high income countries, the IP exporters are opposing the proposal. So we keep continuing our movement. So we think not only for the reason of democracy itself, in the case of COVAX, we can see that the democratic global health governance can be the solution to address both the market and so-called governance failures. That's all. Thank you for listening.
Breathe your own mute.
Yeah. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I was muted there. Sun Kim, thank you very much for your presentation and for your, yeah, well, in a way, your invitation to be part of the People's Health Movement in dealing with not only with the pandemic at the moment, but also dealing with the hijack by corporations of the whole health agenda. Thank you very much. Now I call on Werner Munoz. Werner comes from Costa Rica, and Werner is with us to representing the campaign for global campaign for education. He was previously UN Special Rapporteur on the right to education between 2004 and 10, and he is going to share with us what multi-stakeholderism and corporate capture mean in the field of education. Thank you, Werner.
Hola, buen día. Muchas gracias, Britt. Un saludo desde la campaña mundial de educación. La educación ha estado bajo ataque neoliberal desde adentro y desde afuera. En primer lugar, el ataque se ha concertado ideológicamente, despojando a la educación de sus fines y sometiéndola a una lógica reduccionista para que responda a las dinámicas del mercado y no a la formación integral de las personas. Este ataque degrada los contenidos de la educación, estableciendo jerarquías groseras en el currículum y en los aprendizajes, que ha conducido a la eliminación de las artes, de la filosofía, de los estudios sociales, entre otros. Pero este ataque también se ha ensañado contra la didáctica y la pedagogía, pauperizando, trivializando e incluso en muchos casos criminalizando a docentes y a estudiantes. Durante estos tiempos de pandemia, por ejemplo, hemos escuchado voces altisonantes diciendo que los maestros y maestras son prescindibles, como si la educación fuera un programa de televisión, un show. Pero el ataque también es contra la institucionalidad. Las fuerzas del neoliberalismo demandan la reducción o el desmantelamiento del Estado, por lo que el ataque a los sistemas educativos públicos se ha concentrado en su desfinanciamiento. Estas fuerzas son las mismas que abogan por la privatización y la comercialización de la educación, que como sabemos es particularmente dramática en los sistemas universitarios y en los sistemas de educación preescolar. Un tercer ámbito en que se presenta este ataque es en la gobernanza internacional y particularmente en los espacios multilaterales de discusión política que conducen a procesos de toma de decisiones en materia de inversión, de cooperación y de asistencia técnica para la educación. En estos espacios, los antiguos líderes de la gobernanza internacional educativa, como la UNESCO y la ONU, han cedido su poder y su guía también a empresas y a think tanks que lucran con la venta de libros de texto y con la imposición de pruebas estandarizadas. Y lo han cedido también a corporaciones y a redes de actores comerciales que eufemísticamente se autodefinen como sector privado, que no solo pretenden suplantar a las organizaciones de la sociedad civil, sino que además han encontrado beneplácito para tomar decisiones en su nombre y en nombre de los estados. Estos actores comerciales se proponen como referentes autorizados para tomar decisiones en educación, sin cumplir con su principal obligación, que es pagar impuestos que son necesarios para financiar la educación. Peor aún, estos actores han penetrado las estructuras políticas y de gobernanza educativa mediante las alianzas público-privadas y hacen creer que su participación es legítima, cuando en verdad el principal motivo que los guía es la oportunidad de hacer negocios a costa del Estado y de las familias. Y como dice Pablo Gentili, estamos ante un caso de falsificación del consenso, porque los actores comerciales han cooptado las estructuras de gobernanza internacional de la educación como si existiera una voluntad manifiesta que les permita suplantar a los estados y a la sociedad civil. Lamentablemente, la falsificación del consenso se produce con el presuroso beneplácito de sectores políticos e institucionales. Estas estrategias a veces son tan complicadas y tenebrosas como el mismo mundo del comercio. En otros casos vemos cómo los roles se tornan intercambiables y poco claros, como cuando el enviado especial de educación del secretario general de la ONU es a la vez quien estableció la coalición global de negocios por la educación y quien impulsa iniciativas de endeudamiento de los países frágiles. Los poderes económicos han puesto en emergencia a los sistemas educativos, especialmente en los países empobrecidos, en los que las débiles leyes tributarias les permiten a las corporaciones evadir el pago de impuestos necesarios para mantener la educación pública gratuita y obligatoria. Es así que la justicia tributaria debe ser uno de los principales bastiones de lucha que debe incorporar la ampliación de la participación de la sociedad civil y la toma de decisiones de las personas jóvenes para que dejen de ser vistas como consumidores y puedan construir con sus voces la dignidad que lamentablemente hemos perdido. Muchas gracias por su atención.
Okay. Thank you, Werner. And I think it's very clear that we've reached a stage also of great threat actually to the question of the universal delivery of health, but also the fact that it's become such a field for marketization and for the activity of multi-stakeholder business. Now I come to our last respondent. This is Parminder Jeet Singh from India. And Parminder is here for the IT for Change. He is also leading the Secretariat of the JustNet Coalition. This is a global network really working on digital issues from an equity perspective. And Parminder will now address the question how that sector is dealing with multi-stakeholderism. Thank you, Parminder.
Thank you, Britt. The impact of multi-stakeholderism and corporate capture on the digital is evident in every sector where the digital becomes a substantial part of that sector. And we see it all around us in the non-regulation of those sectors, whether it is the problem which social media caused in the US recently, or in Australia, the problem between Google and content providers, or how Amazon deals with its workers, deals with the traders who trade on its platform, or how Uber deals with drivers. And increasingly, as digital enters more important sectors like education, health, agriculture, similar is happening there. So evidently, the difficulty of regulating these sectors as they get digitalized is associated with something which is inherent with how digital has evolved. So we can go and look at the impact in each of these sectors and how digital has caused a certain non-regulation of those sectors as they get digitalized. But I would, in the short time I have got, touch a few general points which cut across all sectors. I will talk about two things which are unique to multi-stakeholderism and corporate capture in the digital area, and then speak of two things quickly about how what needs to be done and how some groups are trying to organize some resistance to this multi-stakeholderism phenomenon. The two unique things about multi-stakeholderism in the digital sector are that one, in other areas, there were democratic governance or multilateral institutions, and corporate capture came in lately over the last 2 decades, perhaps, and tried to capture space at the expense of the multilateral and democratic governance. But the digital was, in a way, born neoliberal because it was born around the time of the late 90s in the US, where neoliberalism was at ascendance. The first policy frameworks were developed under Clinton era. The first one was a framework for global e-commerce, which very clearly stated that anything digital or internet, it's the private sector which will lead and the governments will stay back. And that kind of thinking entered all countries. I mean, even governments started to think that if it is digital, it's somehow essentially private. So that's how the very notion of digital being outside government regulation, being private or self-regulated, took birth and spread everywhere. Even the World Summit on Information Society, which is the UN summit around this issue, it is the first summit where, when government, civil society, and private sector are mentioned, the private sector is actually mentioned before civil society. And in no other UN summit this is followed. And multi-stakeholderism very is inherent to how the follow-up of the World Summit has taken place. There is a very sordid contemporary history of how capture is still being adapted through very multi-stakeholder spaces, while multilateral organizations are not being allowed, though it was a mandate from the summit. And it has been asked for by developing countries and some civil society organizations for a long time. The second thing, very important and unique, is that digital enters all areas and become a very powerful component of those areas. And if digital is not regulated properly, then as sectors become digitalized, it becomes very difficult to regulate them properly. Actually, the Global Redesign Initiative of World Economic Forum writes this conspiracy in bold letters, where it clearly said that they would like multi-stakeholderism to be the default inside anything which is internet or digital. And as the internet and digital enters all sectors, then through this route of the digitalization, those sectors would also become multi-stakeholder. So that's a very open strategy what World Economic Forum is following. So very quickly now, two things which needs to be done. One is that civil society has to develop an economic rights agenda, which is very missing in the digital space. It's only about privacy, it's about security, it's about civil and political rights. And unless you develop an economic agenda, you tend to be very cozy with private corporations and keep a distance with the governments. And that's what has happened in this area. So developing an economic rights agenda is very difficult, which again, some groups, JustNet Coalition being prime among them, are trying to do. And second thing, which is obvious, is to try to work with certain countries developing countries at the multilateral level becomes difficult, because once we are too much focused, we need to be focused on the political civil rights issue and the problem of a data authoritarian state or a digital authoritarian state. It becomes difficult to work with governments, but we have to nuance our approach and see how we can oppose those governments at home, but at global multilateral level, developing some economic issues, we need to use them to develop multilateral institutions and more democratic institutions at the global level. So these are the two strategies which needs to be followed. Some groups are following it. We welcome anybody to participate in the work of JustNet Coalition in trying to do it in your respective sectors. Thank you, Brett.
Thank you very much, Parminder. Actually, we have run into some difficulties with our time. We did intend to have some time for questions from the floor, and people have been actually posting their questions. We will, unfortunately now have to make a selection, and we will come back to the panelists with some of those questions. So, for example, for Marianne, the question was, can you explain a bit further the role of public-private partnerships in MSIs and how those are integrated there?
Yeah, thank you very much, Brid. I think I've answered that also in the Q&A, but for everybody's knowledge, I think PPPs, they term it now as partnerships and sometimes collaboration. It's one of the cornerstone strategies and approaches of many of the MSIs that we've mapped. It's literally part of the whole way, the whole approach or the way that they work, and they do this through different ways. One, for project-oriented MSIs or multi-stakeholder institutions, they often use national PPPs between different stakeholders, so governments, civil society groups that they invite, as well as corporations. They also do regional PPPs for certain projects, and sometimes they do global PPPs. So I think the point here is that, as Harris has also mentioned, and also this is reflected in the data that we've seen, majority of the MSIs do include PPPs as one or as a key cornerstone strategy and approach. But sometimes they don't use PPPs literally in their project, in their documents and websites. But when you actually read through their project documents, etc., it's actually PPPs. So they term it as either collaboration or partnerships.
There are a few questions that have come up around the whole question of the relation between MSIs and the question of the instruments of global economy. And one of the questions is, to what extent do we believe that changes in global governance will also mean a change in the international economic development? And I would maybe ask Werner to answer that. He was the person who indicated the issue of that the tax justice struggle has to be part of our work in dealing with multi-stakeholderism. You're on mute, Werner, I think. Is he there? Or maybe one other of our panelists would take that. Perhaps he got out. Yet maybe also a related question on that is, how is the IMF and the World Bank facilitating this dominant role of TNCs in the area of MSIs? Who likes to take that? Maybe Mayanne, it's coming back to you because you mentioned the
yes.
question.
Well, for many of us that have been following the World Bank Group and other regional development banks, they do it by different ways. One, the World Bank Group and the World Bank in particular have a financing window for private corporations. So that's basically public public money that's being put into corporations. But I think specifically for the MSIs that we've mapped, the World Bank, in a way, not only are part of decision-making bodies of many MSIs, but they do cherry pick and invite corporations to be part of the MSIs that they are either part of or are convening. So it's sort of like a complementary approach that they do, and they do have a set of corporations that they usually invite to the many spaces that they do, whether it's on agriculture, whether it's on education, or climate and the environment. So across all the sectors that we've identified, the World Bank usually brings in their own corporate partners into this multi-stakeholder initiatives, groups, and institutions.
And yes, this question actually has also been posed from one of the participants would like to ask, what is really the Davos reset agenda? And maybe I would like to ask Harris perhaps to comment on that, and if any of the others would also like to comment on it. Is Harris able to come back?
Thanks, Hubert. And I'll also respond to an earlier question about the global economic connections of multi-stakeholderism. Davos is an advocate for a new system, not only of governance, but how the global economy should be structured with that governance. The battle, in some ways, is between three different trends in the international business community. There's the neoliberal trend, who now are best seen as those who say, in the current crisis, we want to get back to the old system. There's an authoritarian anti-science trend, and there's a multi-stakeholder trend. The reset is Davos's effort to build that third route. Let me give you an example of some of the differences between these three routes. The neoliberal route sees crises and problems, and they want to externalize the costs onto people and onto governments. The authoritarian anti-science group says, there is no problem, just close your eyes and let the problem go on and pretend and externalize the cost, but not say anything. The multi-stakeholder group are quite different. They are prepared to recognize problems, but they want the solutions to be one that's determined by a multi-stakeholder group within a profit-oriented globalization. It's the recognition of the problem publicly that has a powerful handle for civil society and parts of government to say, well, we ought to join them because at least they see the problem. But the answer that they will present is one, as we were hearing on COVID, protects the intellectual property, the structure of the industry, et cetera. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Harris. Yes, of course, the global reset, I think, is what many of us see, and many of the sectors that we have here see as actually the great takeover of the many dimensions of our life, but also the great takeover of global governance. And unfortunately, we don't have time for further questions. We have systematized them, and we will actually, before, when we had our dry run yesterday, our panelists agreed actually to address the questions after. Maybe not tomorrow, but maybe within a week, you will get answers also to your questions. And now I think we come to the last, the last and a very important part of our webinar this afternoon. And I will introduce to you Baba I. Baba is from the Public Services International. He is the Health and Social Sector Officer, and he is also co-president of the G2H2 in Geneva. Baba, you're very welcome. And yeah, we ask you to, since we've had this quite unpacking of what is multi-stakeholderism and what is the global capture of the capture of global governance, we like to ask you, yeah, to share with us your ideas and the discussions that we've had across the sectors in terms of what to do and how urgently we should act. Thank you, Baba.
Thank you very much, Brida. Thank you all. I would say that multi-stakeholderism is the wolf of neoliberalism, wearing the sheep clothing of we are all in the same boat together, and those trying to carry along, you know, civil society organizations and states, whilst the transnational corporations, who also are not only the driving force, but the beneficiaries of neoliberalism, are still essentially those that wield the power. So it's essentially a privatization of governance by other means. And when we see that this capture, the transnational corporations capture over the last 20 years has been, even despite the fact of the Great Recession, we need to be quite careful and fight like no man's business. Now that they're talking of the new reset, all of them are talking of building back better, but building back better in what ways? In ways that put profit first and foremost. We stand for people over profit. Now, what is to be done is the question that faces us, mobilizing to ensure that people drive the process. And thus, we're calling for a democratic reset in opposition to the Great Reset by the transnational corporations with the multi-stakeholderist agenda. The global crisis, as we say, needs global governance with public interest at the heart of it, with the people's interest at the heart of it. This is not to say that even with states, that is the end of democracy. No, we stand for people's sovereignty, democracy from below. Just as I think was Leticia pointing out, we need to fight locally, nationally, regionally, and globally. But the thing is, governments, states, which are duty bearers, should be at the heart of global governance, and not transnational corporations who are accountable to nobody but mammon and their shareholders driving this. It is in the light of this that TNI, PSI, and a number of organizations have come up with this letter as a first step. And in response this Davos week, we have 6 key points there as immediate steps. The first is we demand for a global conference to be called by the World Health Organization to address the global health crisis, and which will have significant civil society participation along with the state, but excludes corporate interests. Secondly, also we look at the issue of food and agriculture, and we demand an international policy response to the hunger crisis, which has deepened significantly in the wake of the pandemic. And we call for a radical transformation of the industrial and corporate controlled food systems towards more healthy, sustainable, and just food systems. These are things that, with multi-stakeholderism driven by TNCs, keep being rolled further backwards. Education, the issues of digital inequity, the issues of, because along with the pandemic, we've all become zombies, more or less, but we forget, and this is just part of the aspects of education, we forget that you also don't have equitable access to these, and that is largely as a result of the for-profit interest at the heart of this, and the governance of this requires free public education and expanding tax base, because if multinational corporations pay their fair share of taxes, you know, there would be enough resource for addressing quite a number of the social and economic challenges of the day across the world. And with education broadly, also we talk of digital rights and a new globally democratic governance mechanism for ensuring digital democracy. And of course, the climate crisis. The climate crisis, what the COVID-19 pandemic has shown has been the interconnectedness of, you know, the environment, our health, and the economy, and the need for governments to kick corporations, you know, out of the question of addressing the climate and environmental crisis cannot be overemphasized. And this is a central element of the demands we are making in calling for immediate steps and calling for putting people and states as against transnational corporations and capital at the heart of global decision making. And a very strategic one that needs to be upended is the signing the strategic partnership agreement between the United Nations and the World Economic Forum. We call for an immediate ending of this. This is a public-private partnership of global governance in the most despicable manner, because it institutionalizes, you know, MSI's multistakeholderism and the privatization of global governance. I see someone there talking of upsetting the reset. Yes, definitely upsetting the multistakeholderist reset is central to the democratic reset that we are mobilizing for. And we just call you, we enjoin you to sign this letter with us, and as we go forward, you know, in the struggles ahead, because part of what is at stake now is creating a new common sense. You know, what we have, what is emerging, what is that over the past decades, there has been a common sense of that, you know, limiting what is possible to what transnational corporations have pushed as what is possible. Even the idea of this ship floating that multi-stakeholderism is taking is still continuation of that neoliberal agenda by other means. So part of what we stand for, part of what this process is driving at is, you know, a new vision and a new reality rooted in people before profit. Join us in signing this, join us in the struggles ahead, and we stand together, we fight together. The people united and determined cannot be defeated. We are at an historic juncture in the world history, and part of that requires that we defeat neoliberalism and multi-stakeholderism. United and determined, we will fight and win. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Baba. I think if we were able to hear each other, we would be clapping. I think you've ended on a very strong note from this webinar, which is we have not only come together to have a catch up on where multi-stakeholderism is at, but indeed actually where multilateralism is at, under great threat, I think, as we've seen, you know, entities like the World Health Organization, the FAO, the COP for the climate, etc., all under threat of the issue of corporate capture. We are challenged, I think, by the speakers in their different sectors, but also by Baba's final conclusion. We are challenged actually to be participants and not simply spectators in this struggle to claim back a participatory democracy, to build together a democracy that's fit for purpose in this 21st century, where indeed transnational corporations are outside the equation of governance. And I think this is one of the key messages we have in the open letter. We hope that you will be able to really get involved in spreading the letter and in making it the basis of conversation, but also the basis of mobilizing for the next year. The World Economic Forum itself will meet in May in Singapore, and there are several moments coming up that are going to be key for example, for the food summit. Also, I'm sure there are going to be very important moments also for health and education. And of course, there will be the climate summit as well. So I think we've put the Davos class and the Davos agenda under scrutiny and also under notice that this is going to be an emerging and strong multi-sectoral struggle and our response as peoples. I really must thank everybody for actually really getting us to the finishing line more or less on time. I want to thank, of course, our interpreters. I want to thank also our people at TNI, especially Jess, who's really helped us to make this a very smooth and interactive webinar. And I also do want to just remind people, if you are interested to stay in touch with TNI, please subscribe to our newsletter. But also we have 2 more webinars coming up this week. This is a very busy, a very busy organization. We have 2 more webinars coming up. We have in just tomorrow, we actually have the whole question about what we can learn for agriculture and the wider agrarian struggles from the world of pastoralism. And this is, of course, extremely important at this time when, the whole issue of agriculture and food is really under threat. And we need to also then, many of us have some really good memories of the Arab uprising, but a decade on, it's very necessary to take a look back at what's happening. And on Friday, the 5th of February, there will be all
Seems we lost Brit at the very last moment. We really thank everyone, all panelists and all participants in this webinar, and we hope you join us in this struggle. We have a half year of many intense activities around this, ending or having an important moment in May during Davos in Singapore. Many thanks to all of you, and we keep in touch.